So welcome to everybody and thank you for joining us this evening. If it's your first time, a warm welcome to you. We do have a code of conduct, which is basically just be respectful to each other so that we all have a lovely time. The chat function will be open for you to ask any questions. If you prefix it with a Q, it helps me spot them for a Q&A at the end. And if you can all keep yourself on mute during the session, it helps drown out any of the background noise and stuff instead. So we'll do some community shout outs at the end for anyone who has anything to advertise. And tonight we welcome the amazing Don Ledingham, founder and CEO of Kianis. He took his experience in education and 2 decades of researching the characteristics of successful leaders. And tonight we're lucky enough to hear him talk to us about wise leadership. So Don, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'll bring up the screen here just now. And I just hope everybody's able to make out my Scottish accent here, but I'll slow down and do my best as I go through here just now. So, yeah, wise leadership within anyone's grasp. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the slides as a kind of as stepping stones as I go through my talk here just now. So, the idea of within anyone's grasp. The reason that I've chosen that is that one of my favourite phrases from Robert Browning, so it's a bit of an adaptation because typically someone writing that time, it was a man's reach should exceed their grasp. But I believe a leader's reach should exceed their grasp. And this idea is about actually the notion of inspiration and ambition. And for me, I think as leaders, wisdom and wise leadership is within our grasp should we wish to extend our reach. The challenge for most leaders, it doesn't necessarily appear on their horizon. And over the course of today, this evening, I'd like to just explore what it means, why it might be of benefit, and how you might actually start to consider going about attempting to reach towards wise leadership. So a little bit about Kianis. Kianis is the Scottish Gaelic word for leadership. So as a business, we mean leadership. We focus primarily in on leadership, and we work nationally and internationally. But I wanted to just say something about our mission, which is to change the world through wise leadership. Now, we had a board meeting yesterday, and one of our board members is 92. He's an amazing man. And he said to me, Don, is this not a bit pompous? Which I probably had to agree. Yes, it probably is pompous. But, sorry, the presentation is just, to change the world through wise leadership, if you like, this is our sense of higher purpose. We're very fortunate to have some fantastic people in our organisation. And the reason that they're wanting to work with us is that they're wanting to have an impact. They want to have an impact more than just necessarily making money. And it's this idea of, we believe that wise leadership can have a positive impact on businesses, on individuals. But actually, if we look, and hopefully as we go through here, if we think of some of our political leaders, were they to behave in wiser than they currently do, it would have a significant impact upon society. So I'd like to explore that as we go through this evening. So wisdom. One of the first things people ask me, so how do you define wisdom? And we'll go on to explore what that might be. But I actually think people do innately and intuitively know what wisdom means. So before we go on, I'd like you to choose someone that you know, someone who you know personally or have known personally in your life. And I'd like you to write that person's name down, if you would, just in front of you. Who is that person? It might be a member of your family. It might have been a teacher. It might have been a fellow colleague. It might have been a boss that you've had. Who is that person? And if you could write that person's name down just now, what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and make this idea of wisdom and wise leadership become concrete. So if you could write that person's name down just now, and then reflecting on this person, whoever it might be, and I've got my wise leader in mind just now, I'd like you to try and note down, what were the 3 key characteristics, do you think, that contributed to making this person wise in your eyes? What are those 3 characteristics? And if you could just jot these down just now, So 1, 2, 3, not necessarily in an order of priority, just as they come to you. And what you might like to do is maybe drop Barbara a note there as to what those characteristics are, and we'll maybe reflect on these at the end. So if you could I'll just give you a couple of minutes, or maybe not as long as that even, just a minute or so, just to actually jot those characteristics down. The 3 characteristics of your wise leader. So as I say, it could be a member of your family. It could have been a family friend from way, way back. It could even be a brother. Sometimes it can even be a child, teacher, a boss, but someone that you know. We're not looking for a figure from history or, a political figure, someone that you know, someone much closer to home. That if you were asked, how would you describe them? One of the words that you would use would, they're actually wise. They're actually a wise person. Okay, so hopefully we've done that, and we'll return to that as we go through. But perhaps as we're going through this evening, I'd like you to keep cross-referencing what I'm talking about with your wise figure. So wise leadership. Well, I want to start, first of all, this is not another leadership theory, okay? It's not another model. At the last count, there are 658 different leadership theories, models, and styles. Most of them contained in books that I've got behind me. But wise leadership is not a leadership theory. But if it's not a theory or a model or a style, what is it? And really, this is what I'd like to unpack with you this evening. But before I do that, I just want to pick up on some of the Kianis principles about how we work. And there are 3 things. And those people that know me will probably understand the first point, which is keep it simple, in that we try to avoid complexity. And that's basically because I don't think I'm clever enough to do anything beyond that. So it's trying to keep it simple. The other one is less is more. And as I've gone through my life, I've come to understand that less is more. Rather than trying to confuse with over elaborate descriptions and more words, it's about refinement. And I think that's one of the things I enjoy about poetry, that we can capture the essence in as few words as possible. And this final principle is critical to what we believe in Kianis, is that we do not believe that leadership behavior is fixed. I am a teacher by profession and birth. I wanted to be a teacher from the age of 9. My whole experience tells me, working with young people, is that behavior is never fixed. And we talk all about growth mindsets, etc. But actually, I believe this is a fundamental educational principle, that we can change our behavior. But part of that is about, first of all, enabling ourselves, opening ourselves to the opportunity that might happen. So wise leadership, what is our definition? So it's doing the right thing at the right time for the right reasons. So let's just unpack that a little bit. Just look at the first word in this, doing. We believe that wise leadership is about action. It's not about talking about it. It's not about writing about it. There are lots of people that talk about things, but you can only be judged through your actions. So wise leadership is something that is judged through your actions. Think about the individual that you were describing as your wise person, your wise leader. Why do you make that judgment? Because you have observed their behavior. They lived consistently with what they said. And then we've got this notion of the right thing at the right time for the right reasons. And I'll tell you a little bit more about right as we go on here. But the interesting thing here is that wise leadership, that notion of a judgment, is not necessarily consistent all the time. What might have been the wise thing to do a year ago is not necessarily the wise thing to do now. And we can see that quite clearly in terms of the pandemic. What it might have been judged to be a wise decision 12 months ago to do that, the same behavior now, would be described to be ignorant. And 12 months on from now, that such situation might change again. So it's doing the right thing at the right time for the right reasons. And it's a judgment about action. It's about making a decision about what are we going to do. Now, I've got a very awkward wife. Her name is Jill, and she's very patient with me. But when I've been showing her this, she's a good borderer, and she said to me, but what does right mean? And it gets to the heart of it. What do you mean by right? So by right, and it took a while, it put me back on my heels a little bit. But what do we mean by right? Well, first of all, we mean ethical. And by ethical, ethical is about doing good. It's also about doing no harm, back to the old Hippocratic oath. And it's also about justice. For us, it's also about taking account of the common good. And I'll unpack what I mean about that a little bit later on. And finally, and I think this is a critical element of wise leadership, it's geared towards a sustainable future. Now, we're talking about sustainable future here in its widest sense, not just in terms of the narrower environmental dimension of sustainability, but we're talking here about a sustainable future. Whatever we're working in, a wise leader is dedicated to enabling it to succeed and evolve and sustain itself. And so much of our behaviours that we see nowadays in terms of leadership are actually the opposite of that. It's about short-term gain, it's about quick exit, it's about short-term popularity, and not necessarily about a longer-term sustainable future. So we'll go on to explore that as we go on. So as we've gone through this, and this work, it's strange how this has evolved. I first started writing a monthly article for the Times Educational Supplement about 15 years ago. That's quite a challenge every month, having to come up with a new article. But as I reflected on these articles, the element that was linking them all together was the idea of wise leadership. And as I started to tease this out, these three elements started to fall out from my work. The first notion that leadership is a way of behaving. In order to make a judgment about leadership, you don't listen to what someone says, you observe what they do. So for us, leadership is a way of behaving. And be very suspicious of anybody who talks about leadership but never actually demonstrates it. Connected to that is this idea that wisdom for us is a way of thinking. If you're into computers, you might like to think of it as the operating system. It's what's running in the background that allows you to make decisions about how you're going to behave. And then finally, this notion of ways of looking. And this has been a really powerful element of our discovery over the last 20 years, is that how we think is informed by what we see and how we see it. And I intend to explore that. So those three elements are going to be a recurring theme as we go through this evening. Leadership is a way of behaving. Wisdom is a way of thinking, and wise leadership is a way of thinking. But the way of looking is actually critical, enabling us to observe ourselves and to look at the problems and challenges that we face. So let's move on here, and let me just introduce you to what we call our Kianis curve. I've got a great friend called George Elliott. Some of you may know him. And George has been very kind to Kianis over the years. And he's been very patient with me. But George said to me, all right, Don, this is all very interesting, but can you present what you do in one sheet of paper, in one diagram? And my God, that is a really hard thing to do. It's a really hard thing to do. And through trial and error over a long, long period of time, we developed what we've called the Kianis curve. And in a sense, it's a proposition. It's what we do. So if we look at this vertical axis here, this is about performance and leadership performance. We're starting here at the status quo. So that will vary for all of us. And this is time. But actually, I like this notion of the future, about where we're going. And what we're interested in is helping leaders change their behavior. But if you only think of changing behavior in a training sense, training for us, and I don't mean this in any disrespect, but if you just teach people skills, it's actually a flat line. And as soon as you stop engaging with the person, there's not necessarily any upward development. So we're interested in a process of education. And in that process of education, it's a combination between those three elements. So for us, it's ways of looking. And we've established a number of analytical tools that allow people to look at their behavior. And it's quite shocking sometimes. But I should also say a key principle for us is that all of the ways of looking, all the analytical data that we gather about an individual belongs to the individual. Now, everybody says they've done 360. The problem with 360, it's become compromised and tied up with performance management as opposed to performance improvement. And if you're learning, you need to be honest with yourself. But if that's tied up with appraisal and management and performance and pay, it becomes compromised. So this unlocks the leader. But then we also need to provide a structure, a framework that allows people to start to think differently about how they make decisions. And it's the combination of those two elements that we find that can help to change people's behavior. And this is this important notion of an exponential curve. Because if we get off this journey here, so let's say as a teacher, I stop working with a child or a student at this point, if I've done my job well, their learning process goes on well beyond the time which we've worked with them. And ultimately, in terms of what we are trying to do in terms of wise leadership, is about adding sustainable value to themselves, sustainable value to their organization, and hopefully sustainable value to society. And that is, in a sense, is what we describe as the Kianis curve. So, wisdom then is a way of thinking, and wise decision making. And what I've discovered, I say as if I've discovered, I mean, we probably all know this, but when you ask people, how do you go about making decisions? Most people find it really difficult to explain how they do it. They just say, well, I just make them. I've just learned a way of making decisions. That's just how I do it. But they can't explain to you how they do it. And so this notion of tacit knowledge or implicit knowledge, which has fascinated me probably for about 30 years now in my career, is at the core of this. And what we are trying to do when we're working with people is to shift from the tacit to allow them to the decision-making process to start to become explicit, where they're starting to reflect upon how I make decisions. And once you start to understand how you're making decisions, you can then start to explore how might I make different decisions. But if you don't make that journey, the change in behavior is not going to happen. So it's absolutely fundamental to this element of helping people to understand how do you currently think and how might we shape and influence the way that you're thinking that will allow you to behave differently. So what I'm going to take you through, this has evolved, again, it really is giving away my age, but this has probably evolved over a 20-year period. And at first, when I first started exploring this, it was probably, this wheel was probably the equivalent of 100,000 words. So if we think of a funnel, this is the consequence of that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through the elements or the features of the wheel of wise leadership. Now, I must just say there is not necessarily always a sequential order here in terms of how, and I'm going to present these to you not in this particular order here, but sometimes when we're helping people to embed this, giving them a structure to it can help. But actually in terms of a sequential order of how you might make these, there's not necessarily a definitive way of doing that. So I don't want to lead you down this route that you must think, oh, I need to do it in this order. Learning it that way can help. But actually once you are into starting to embed it and making it automatic, I'm flitting between those features much more automatically. So the first of those is to be self-aware. Now, it was Aristotle who said that wisdom is self-awareness is the beginning of all wisdom. So actually, or knowing oneself is the beginning of all wisdom. And it's this capacity to be self-aware. Now, so many people do psychometric testing and other forms of evaluation these days. Yes, I'm this characteristic, or I'm that, or I'm this. But that's just pigeonholing you. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to avoid people from pigeonholing themselves, but using that self-knowledge to allow themselves to make judgments about how might I change. So over the last 25 years, we've developed this model, which again, my love of metaphor and of poetry has informed this. This is intended to represent a lens that can be closed or opened. And it is made up of 7 different lenses, none of which is any more important than another. And I'll just introduce these to you very quickly. So the conductor This is the notion of the upfront leader, inspiring, directing, coordinating, pulling performance, inspiring people beyond what they think they're capable of. The parent, nurturing, supporting, loving, forgiving, treating with unconditional positive regard. The builder with their plans, with their rules and regulations, compliance, seeing it through. The villager with their sense of community. I live in the borders here as part of a community. We're here for each other. Sense of belonging is hugely important. The scientist who knows the numbers, who knows the data, who builds upon the wisdom or the knowledge of others, who uses the data and can make an objective judgment without being influenced necessarily by emotions. Of course, they are sometimes. The gardener is about a long-term view. The story I tell here is a Melrose Abbey, which was built in the 11th century down here when the Masons came across from France. They planted acorns around the abbey. Why did they do that? Because they knew that in 400 years' time, the Masons, their successors, would require easy access to oak trees. So the gardener is thinking forward. The gardener is seeing what's going to happen in the short, medium, and long term and how things will come together. And finally, there's the sculptor, the innovator, the creative, the person who's comfortable with uncertainty, is adaptable and can make those shifts, uses their intuition. And what we're doing when we're looking here with leaders is we're trying to help people become self-aware about where their defaults are. Now, it's important about this word. Default doesn't mean you need to be trapped in that particular way. And as leaders, our characteristics are a combination of all of these. We may default more to one than another, and I'll just show you. These are my colleagues and associates in Kianis. And here I am here. This is my profile. And interestingly, sculptor is my top lens. And you can see that there's not many other people have got it as high as that. Now, you might say there's a tendency when we look at this kind of work where you say, oh yeah, right, Don, you're a builder, so you need to improve that. We need to send you on a course because you need to become a better builder. Well, actually, what we've discovered actually, sometimes the best changes you can make is just to tone down, to close down the aperture a little bit on the sculptor, because people that used to work with me, or perhaps people who still work with me, can say I'm a bit of a pain in the backside because I'm just flowing with ideas. And sometimes it's about just stop. So it's about building an understanding of where your defaults are and how can I start to shift. So if I just move on from there to look at this idea of, and this is a really interesting one, where imagine a leader who has a very, very strong parent, is a very strong parent. In other words, they will hold your hand. They will be there for you anytime. Day or night, you can pick up the phone to them. They'll solve your problem for you. But what that creates is a dependency. And what we're looking at here is that this notion of an individual, let's take this individual who's a very strong parent. They just might want to close that aperture down just a bit, or maybe even quite a lot. And that's that shift that can really start to open up an opportunity for a leader to start to explore different behaviors. But this notion of self-awareness and starting to recognize where my biases are, where my particular points of focus are, where I go to first, really starts to open the door for people to start to look at, actually, there's some opportunities for me here to actually start to change. And escaping from this idea of, no, you're this, you stay in that box because we've got other people. Actually, why can't I do that? Why can't I, as Browning said, reach beyond my grasp and try something else and reach for that? And if wisdom was perhaps something that I wanted to go for, and this is what I find fascinating about this area, wisdom is rarely do young people say, what type of leader would you like to be when you get older? Well, I'd like to be a chief executive and I'd like to earn £200,000 a year. But rarely will they say, actually, I'd like to be wise. We think that wisdom will only come about and be accrued through experience. I'm sorry to tell you, I've worked with plenty 60+ leaders who are not wise. So wisdom does not necessarily accrue through experience. It accrues with how you look at the world, how you look at yourself, and how you behave. So linking to this, so we've covered self-awareness. We're now going to this idea of seeing alternative perspectives. And this idea of seeing alternative perspectives is is really challenging in terms of we tend to see the world through our own eyes. But how could we push ourselves to look at the world through other people's eyes? Now, I'm not going to pick on any particular political leaders that are in the news at the moment, but I'll leave you to judge yourself for that. But the tendency only to look at a challenge through your own perspective, what suits our needs, as opposed to standing in other people's shoes. And we look at things, we're doing some really interesting things in Kianis just now around the Black Lives Matter agenda, with some very challenging conversations around about our own behaviour, and listening to one of our colleagues who's in Kianis as a black man, and listening to his experiences, is hugely challenging, and pushing ourselves out of our comfort zone to listen to that. But ultimately, if we don't change our behaviour, then nothing has changed. So again, we can use the lenses here, perhaps, or not perhaps, but actually to look at leading through those lenses. So I can look at from a parent point of view, and I think I said I wasn't going to mention anybody, but if I mentioned Jacinta Ardern in New Zealand, this notion of being able to look at things through from the lens of the parent, her compassion, her empathy, and her support, but then linking that with the conductor lens of her presence, her clarity, and her direction. And again, I don't want to talk about other leaders, but you can imagine there are some other leaders that we've experienced seeing around the world who are not necessarily behaving with either of those characteristics. So this is about pushing you out from your own default point of view. It's really uncomfortable. It's really uncomfortable. And I am consistently trying to push myself out of my point of view, which I've been brought up with. And it's hugely challenging when you're starting to do that, but I think incredibly enabling. Which leads us neatly to this notion of enabling others. I remember when I was first appointed as a head teacher, and I sat at my big desk, and people would knock on the door, and they would come in and they would ask me problems. They would ask me, I've got a problem. And what was my first reaction? I would give them an answer. Whether or not I knew what the solution was, I gave them my answer, because that's the expectation as a leader. You need to be certain. One of the things that wise leaders can do is actually they can recognize that they are not the expert, and they can enable. Now, I think the word here, enable, is important as opposed to empower. Empower is the more popular word, but empowering is just giving people temporary authority. I can take it away from you if I like. Enabling, the notion of teaching a woman to fish allows her to feed her and her family for the rest of her life. I've enabled it. I cannot take that ability away from her. So the notion of a really wise leader is not about empowering. It's about giving people the means to do things for themselves and having the confidence in yourself to step back and to allow that to happen. So we go on here to making sense out of complexity. So the world is a complex place, challenging, and so many leaders actually try just to use that as an excuse. A wise leader seeks to find a pattern, seeks to make sense out of those challenging issues for the people that they lead. And again, I think the use of metaphor, but particularly the use of story, to allow that to cut through the jargon, the complexity, as I said, the 100,000 words that were written about wisdom, to pull it down to something that can make sense for other people. But all too often, what leaders do is actually they use this as an excuse. So they will be lost in the data. They will lose people in the information, and you lose people here in this space by confusing them with just blind numbers. Whereas we come to the top of this wisdom pyramid, and it's our role here to bring together all of the data, all of the information, all of the available knowledge, but then to synthesize that and to be able to present it to people that actually makes sense, that enables them to make judgments for themselves, enables them to actually change their own behavior. The creating a sustainable future. I described the Melrose Abbey case, but again, in my career, yes, many years of, particularly in the education field, but now working with businesses across the world, so many leaders' decisions are short term. We have a problem, let's fix it. We have another problem, let's fix it. So many businesses are looking at, they start off thinking about what's our exit strategy, because we're going to earn so much money from doing that, as opposed to thinking, how can we make a sustainable impact upon society? How can the decisions that we're taking now actually contribute towards something which will leave a positive impact on our community, on the people that we work with, and upon society? It's a hugely challenging agenda, and I'll show you something towards the end of this presentation, which connects to this idea of really using this as the driver. So as you're starting off, we should be thinking towards where we're going. I use a phrase, reversing into the future. Actually, imagine what that future looks like. And then let's reverse into that future, because we've already imagined what it's going to look like. I have a crazy dream that Kianis might be around in 100 years' time. I think it would, my great-great-granddaughter might be chief executive of Kianis at that time. Crazy idea, perhaps, but I think it was just read it today. Jeff Bezos talked about, if you as an organization are imagining and thinking yourself 7 years forwards, you're in a tiny minority of businesses or organizations. So thinking about how are you going to be in 7 years' time, there's very few other people thinking like that. So to go to 10 years, 20, 30, I have to say, some of the businesses and family businesses in India and in Japan who actually take that approach are quite incredible, and the contribution that they also make to society in that sense. So we've got searching for the common good. I think this is proving to be probably the most important part of our work. The common good, you can tease this out for yourselves, but it's essentially, it's for the good of the majority. And this is fascinating, particularly when it comes in conflict to the needs, desires, wishes, rights of the individual. At what point do those two things come into conflict? There's a wonderful example, living example of it at the moment as our lives are changing. As our own individual rights and needs and wishes and desires are compromised for the common good. Think of how we've had to change because of, particularly in relation to enabling the National Health Service to conduct itself, to protect it. We've had to limit our own rights, and we've voluntarily made that choice, although there have been rules and regulations. But if it's presented clearly and concisely, and we can cut through the complexity, it becomes an incredible driver for good. And this is where it becomes an obligation for leaders. It's not a choice. Wise leaders have an obligation towards fulfilling and searching for the common good. And finally, we've got making courageous and ethical decisions. And it's at this nexus, at this point, wise leadership comes alive. Everything else contributes to it, but it's lots of courses are run nowadays on making courageous decisions. I have to tell you, so many of them are about how you're going to deal with troublesome staff. They're not necessarily about making the courageous decision about where are we taking this organization? How do we want to behave? Where are we going to go? And courageous must be linked to ethical. These two things, without ethical, there are many leaders who will make courageous decisions. Yes, we need to fire 300 people, or yes, we need to close that factory, or yes, we need to change production. But if you combine it with this notion of ethical, which again just is doing good, doing no harm, the notions of justice, searching for the common good, and ultimately about making those decisions that are actually going to benefit society in terms of a sustainable decision. So coming back and just starting to wind up, this idea of wise leadership is about doing. It is about behavior. It's doing the right thing. It's doing it at the right time, and it's doing it for the right reasons. And it's an act of judgment. We picked up on this idea of ways of looking and ways of thinking, but ultimately it's this notion of ways of behaving. And I just wanted to close really on this. I think this is Warren Buffett, the very famous investor, talks about, you know, the compounding effect. That's the reason that Berkshire Hathaway have been so successful. But I think there's a compounding effect of wise decision making, and small changes can lead to large gains. So let's explore this. So 1 to the power of 365 equals 1. In other words, if I just conduct myself in relation to how I behaved yesterday and how I behaved the day before, i.e. stick with the status quo, then a year from now, it's just going to be the same. If I could just make my decision 1% better, now obviously this is a metaphorical notion, how could you measure that? But 1% more, so 1.01 to the power of 365, that takes that up to 37.8. So it's actually a 37 times stronger result. So you don't need to make wise decisions in terms of the big decision, but just accumulating those small decisions can give you a huge return. But look what happens when we go 1% less, where we maybe make that short-term decision. Yes, it solves the problem, but actually it actually damages where I'm going. It damages our future. So that 0.99 to the power of 365 takes us to 0.03, or 1,500 times a weaker result. And it picks up on this idea of the compounding effect of wise decision making, where we've got this idea, I make a decision one day, I make another decision the next that's wise, I build on that with another, I build on that with another, I build another, and I build another, and as they accumulate, we're starting to get this compounding effect. And so many times I've seen this with wise leaders, you wonder, how have they done that? And it's because their decision making is consistent. They have a framework, they think about what they're doing, they're dedicated to meeting the needs of the common good, and they make courageous and ethical decisions. They're not scared to decide. Those leaders here on this side might be just as effective in the short term. They're making decisions, but they're not wise. And gradually it has a deteriorating impact upon the organization. So, where are we? I just want to share this poem with you. What I asked you earlier on about the characteristics of your 3 wise leaders. A while back, I did a piece of research, and I pulled together 100 proverbs from around the world. Chinese, Japanese, Asian, North American Indians, South America, Africa, and pulled everything I could find as a proverb to do with wisdom. And what was incredible as I pulled it together was the consistency across cultures, the consistency about what wisdom was across languages, the consistency across time. And with your permission, I'd like just to read this out. And actually, as I go through, perhaps if you could you look, is there a characteristic that you have identified in your wise leader that is mentioned in the poem? The fool will rarely listen, preferring through omission to fill the space of thoughtful hush that lines that start with I. The wise prefer to listen, a time for acquisition, and only speak to understand and ask the reasons why. The fool blindly follows others, where shared opinions smother, thoughts that go against the grain of mainstream status quo. The wise don't heed convention and have no apprehension before they set in motion thoughts that tip a domino. The fool takes no correction and sees it as rejection, a personal attack that dents shallow confidence. The wise don't fear objection and seek interrogation if it generates ideas of greater consequence. The fool hoards information as a means of confirmation that rank has been achieved and that power is retained. The wise set out to distribute, to see their knowledge contribute, and carry wisdom lightly as if it were the wind. The fool lives in the present, takes no account of dissent, and is driven by self-interest and absence of respect. The wise look back and forwards to the past and to the future, seeing them as one and making them connect. For fools are sadly destined to lead their lives unquestioned and see themselves correct in everything they do. Yet the wise, who seem uncertain and who never cease to question, will lead the more fulfilling life where all they do is true. There's a link here, folks, if you want to find out more about wise leadership on the PowerPoint on Leadership Unlocked. I'll not say any more about that. But just to leave you with these amazing words from Seamus Heaney in his poem, The Cure at Troy, one of the most spectacular poems I've read in the last 20 years. And it's about hope. And the line that jumps out for me is, believe that a further shore is reachable from here. And for me, as a society, and as leaders of businesses, of organizations, of countries, the prize of wise leadership is worth fighting for. We should attempt to reach beyond our grasp and see if it's explore the opportunities to change our behavior, to behave in line with that aspiration. And if we could, then there is just a small chance that we might change our world. Thank you very much, folks.
Well, thank you so much for that, Don. That was fantastic. Does anyone have any questions for Don? Go on, be brave. I think we're all so enraptured there, just chatting away. That was just brilliant. I'll tell you what, I actually have one. So just out of curiosity, when you're working with leaders and they, have to face an uncomfortable truth, by the time that they're working with you and, on a kind of quest for getting better at this,
yes.
Are they quite often kind of ready to face that kind of uncomfortable truth, or is it difficult?
I think this is a really interesting question. So the Kianis Leadership Index, which is our lens piece, we find that people are incredibly honest there. So we do something first. We do what we call our hinterland exercise, first of all, which is, who are you? Which is understanding their background, where are they from, their family, their experience as a child. But actually I cannot overstate this point about people understanding that this process belongs to them. Their employer might be paying, but the process belongs to the individual. And I think there's a huge suspicion in work these days that anything like this, there's an ulterior motive behind it. And if there's an ulterior motive suspected, then people are guarded. But if you open it up, and our fundamental value as an organization is building trusted relationships. If you establish that trust, and I mentioned our 92-year-old board member, he's called Sir Charles Fraser, the most amazing man I've ever met in my life. And he says his career was all about dedicated to helping others. If people believe that we're dedicated to helping them, my experience over the last 10 years is people are incredibly open. And by opening up to us, they open up to themselves. And that's one of the most rewarding things as I'll use that phrase again, a teacher. Because once you've opened that box of self-awareness and connect it to the idea of, actually, do you know what? You can change. It's going to be tough. Then it's an absolute joy. Nothing I do feels like work, actually, Barbara. It just feels like fun.
The dream.
It is indeed.
Anyone else got a question?
Jim Boyd here. Thank you, Don. Thanks very much for your presentation. So you've got that leadership wheel that you talked about, yes, and the characteristics of wisdom as you define them. Obviously, the people that approach you and come to you seeking help have their own motivation for doing that. When you engage with them initially, to what extent do you gauge their wisdom? Are they, in the doldrums and needing a lot of help, or are they kind of halfway there, or, just where are they on the scale?
I think making a judgment about someone's wisdom, I don't think you are not entitled to make that judgment until you've got to know them. And that takes quite a while. The ultimate paradox about wisdom is that, firstly, if you claim to be wise, you're automatically excluded from being wise. Wisdom is something that only can be ascribed to you by others, and it can only be ascribed by watching how you behave. So I would resist making a judgment about whether or not somebody is wise or not until I've started to get to know them. What I'm suggesting to people is that this is an area worth exploring. This decision making, changing the way in which you make decisions is worthwhile. And it's only through that process of them starting to explore and experiment with that do we start to see that. I mean, I have been very fortunate to work with many leaders who I would now describe as being incredibly wise, and they were wise, quite frankly, before I started working with them. All I have perhaps given them is a structure to be more conscious of what they do, and in a sense try and make even better decisions and better even actions as a leader that have a more positive impact upon their organisation.
Thank you.
Anybody else got any questions this evening? There must be some curious minds out there tonight, guys. Come on. No? Oh, we've got one from Roddy here saying, how can you improve your self-awareness?
Well, I think by asking a question, first of all, like that, Roddy, would be is a great start, because a lot of people actually think they are self-aware, but they're quite comfortable to actually put themselves into just, this is who I am. I'm in this fixed place. To engage in self-awareness, where you're actually going to start to challenge yourself, I would say one of the most interesting things to do. We're actually all quite comfortable to talk about what we're not good at. We're less conscious, perhaps, of knowing what we're really good at. We're less comfortable at saying what am I brilliant at, and less comfortable at actually saying how might I actually play that, go there less. And I think that's a really interesting route to go, is not to always go to your default strength, but to start to explore by turning that down, closing the lens down a bit, and allowing some of your assets. But it's an interesting thing about Scottish people particularly have a real problem to say, when I ask the question, what are you brilliant at? A lot of people struggle with that. And in my experience, we're all brilliant at something. And it's really important that we understand what that area is.
We've got a great question here from Christoph. He says, how do you know that the decisions you make are wise? One, you know it when they are made in accordance to your value shift, your framework. Two, when you know they've made a positive impact based on your value framework, which is subjective. And three, when people support them, this may be achieved through coercion and influence.
Yeah. So is that a question or a statement?
Christoph might be better to answer that.
Christoph, yeah. Can you just a little bit more on that? It's a question. Okay, right. Okay. So could you just repeat them again for me, if you wouldn't mind, there, Barbara?
So they're in the chat there. So how do you know that decisions you make? How do you know the decisions you make are wise? One, you know it when they are made in accordance to your value shift framework. Two, when you know they made positive impact based on your value framework, which is subjective. Or three, when people support them, this may be achieved through coercion and influence.
Yeah. Certainly, how do you know if that decision? I think the values piece for me is really interesting to start off with. You know what your values framework is. It's an interesting thing that when you start to tease out what people's values are, they don't necessarily, are not able to give you an immediate response as to what my own value set is. They can maybe trot out what their organization's values are, but it's not necessarily connected to reality. Too many organizations have got a list of values. They don't necessarily translate into their behavior. I think, for me, in terms of whether or not they're wise, starts to really play on to observing what's the impact of those decisions, what's the observable impact. And I think if you've consistently led and you've connected to the principles that I've been describing today, then I think particularly if it's impacting upon the common good, if you've made courageous decisions, but they are fundamentally ethical, and I can give you a number of examples where people have made courageous decisions, but they're not ethical decisions. And I think this notion of sustainability. So is this decision that you've made, is it just made in the short term? In terms of coercion and influence, leadership is about influence. It is about influence. Coercion, it depends how critical the situation is. Sometimes in an emergency situation, it's not coercion, it's instruction, and that's sensible. But you know, in the grand scheme of things, they're a very, very small proportion of decisions that you make or actions that you take as a leader. It's much more about influence. And people follow people who have a sense of higher purpose and connect their behavior to their values and are consistent with that. And that's where, hopefully, wise leaders, you can make a judgment about whether or not people are consistent with that. I mean, I was reading again, and some people, he's getting more criticism than he used to in terms of Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett. But one of his great features, he is very self-deprecating. He recognizes what his own weaknesses are. But you could not say he has not lived his life in consistency with his values as he goes forwards. And I would say he has fulfilled many of the characteristics of being a wise leader.
And we have one from Scott here.
Thanks, Christoph. Appreciate that.
Have you seen any organizations that actively reward leaders for wisdom? And can you tell us what that reward system looks like?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure many organizations are hardwired to actually support wisdom. All too often, the quick exit, the financial reward incentivizes behaviors that are not necessarily wise. And I have to say, a lot of the startup culture needs to really look at itself in terms of, because even though I'm old and grey, I like to think I'm an entrepreneur. You know, our business is only 6 years old. But hopefully we're growing for the future. So I often talk about, you know, we don't go into marriage thinking about what our exit plan is, or if you are, there's a problem, you know. Yet we'll often go to business thinking what our exit problem is because I'm going to capitalize on this great idea. I think there's huge lessons to be learned from family businesses. Family businesses are incredibly successful at sustaining themselves through challenging times and in looking after their people and in contributing towards society. And you can look internationally for those examples. There's a company in India called Godrej, which I think is over 70 years old now. 25% of their profits go back into the community, directly into the community. It's a multi-billion pound company. And I think one of the things that we've lost in the UK and in Europe are the notion of family businesses. Family businesses actually, I think, can be driven very much down that moral purpose, and the values are passed on through. Sorry.
What was that?
Like the Trumps.
Oh,
Like the Trumps.
Like the Trumps, exactly like the Trumps. Yeah, there's a fantastic example of a family business that behaves consistently, indeed. Yeah, well, for every example that you can give, you can always flip the side. I think there's very many. I'm fascinated by that whole piece. But yeah, well, we'll not get into that one there just now, Scott. But I think there will be some very interesting things come out in the fullness of time that will demonstrate that the Trump family is not a wise family. But we'll leave that hanging there just now.
any other questions?
Oh, Christoph's got another one.
Here we go. How leaders reach the understanding of their higher purpose?
Well, higher purpose is a really interesting one. Yeah. This is a big part of the work that we do with people. So higher purpose for me is what creates an energy in an organization. Higher purpose creates discretionary effort. Let's say I love the 80-20 rule. Most people give 80% effort in their work, but it leaves us another 20. If you can create a sense of higher purpose, so as I say, our purpose is to change the world through wise leadership. And yes, it could be pompous, but you know what? it's what I bounce out of bed in the morning to try and do. I've worked in some organisations where it's very difficult to identify what that higher purpose was. It was confusing. There was no consistency. The leaders didn't connect to it. But where you connect to that higher purpose, I think it can have an incredibly powerful impact of making people feel good. So we work with, I'll take one example, IQ student accommodation. Their sense of higher purpose is to give students their best year yet, and they do it consistently. And everybody in that business is driven by it. Now, it's a commercial organisation, but by pulling out that mission, it really has connected with them. But I can think of a number of organisations that I've worked with that it really, that is the differentiator. And unfortunately, well, you maybe need to think about where you work yourselves, folk. Do you know what your organisation's mission is? And what is that sense of, and mission and higher purpose for me are one and the same thing. What is its higher purpose? I think we can see it in the NHS. I was brought up the son of a GP and in Portobello, and he would get up out of bed at 2 o'clock in the morning, any morning, every morning, to go to a patient. Why? Because it was a sense of duty. It was a sense of obligation. It was this notion of service to the common good. And I think as organisations, we need to think about how we connect to this, back to this notion of common good.
Great question there. Any other ones from the group tonight?
Christoph's got a point here. What's he saying? What's he saying there, Barbara?
He said, in my previous job, I was called by a colleague people pleaser because I wanted to support people and make sure that they feel good with themselves and the work they do.
He was called a people feeder.
A people pleaser.
A people pleaser.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's interesting, but then you've got to think as a parent, if you're only pleasing people, and I think of it as or if we think of as a feeder, someone's a feeder as well. But if we take as a parent, parenting's tough, okay? And to be a leader and a parent, you don't need to be a parent in order to be a good leader. But taking this metaphor, it's good parenting is here are the boundaries and here are the lines, and if you step over them, there are consequences. If, as a teacher or as a parent, I'm constantly backing off and redrawing the line, people are lost. And you need to be able to prepare in that. I talked about enabling earlier on in the presentation. Great parents enable, but also they don't create that dependency. So I think you're probably being very hard on yourself, or your colleagues were being hard on you, Christoph, because I'm sure you managed to do it with balance. But I think supporting people, engaging with people, but ultimately, there's a lovely saying, it was Goethe said, giving children roots and wings. I love that statement. And as a good leader gives people roots and they give them wings. So in other words, you give them the sense of stability, the sense of belonging, but you also allow them to fly. And that requires some quite sophisticated behavior in you as a leader for that to happen. Thank you. Barbara, I'm curious maybe what people wrote down as their 3 characteristics for the people that they chose. I wonder if anybody would be happy to share who they chose and what their characteristics were.
Does anyone want to volunteer their thoughts on that one? Go on. I can tell you about mine. I put down. Does someone volunteer there? Oh no.
No. On you go. Who have you got?
So mine was an old boss of mine, Ross, and the characteristics I wrote was patience, experience, and willing to see others grow and succeed.
Well, there we go. If we pick that enabling space, so you're right into there, and I think the notion of patience is actually about sustainable futures. So that's lovely. That's lovely. Yeah, if we could maybe pick another couple, folks, that'd be great. Sath, what did you have? Did you pick anybody?
No, I didn't do that, Don. I was visualizing your session. I'll show you that after.
I look forward to that.
Jim Boyd here. I'd be happy to share mine.
Yes, please.
So I chose an ex-colleague of mine, unfortunately no longer with us, Alex Roberts. He was a professor at Heriot-Watt University in the business school.
Yes,
and
and what were the
Alex, for me, is
characteristics?
incredibly generous. He was hungry to learn. He was incredibly generous. He was hungry to learn, even when he was, on his last legs.
Isn't that
And he
fantastic?
was people smart as well.
People smart, yeah, people smart. But I love that notion of hungry to learn. You know, as I say, we've got this 92-year-old gentleman on our board, and he's hungry to learn. Still that openness, that role modelling piece, I think is really important. And for me, that's also about I would suspect when someone's like that, they're not looking into the past. They're still looking towards the future, Jim. You know, and I think that's a really interesting element in terms of great leadership, is not to be locked into the present or always looking over your shoulder. And the really wise people that I've got, I've come into contact with, are looking forwards, as your colleague was. Thank you for that.
Does anyone else want to share theirs?
I'm sure there's a man, John O'Neill, could say something here. I recognise that name, if he's still there.
How are you doing, Don?
I'm very good, my friend. I'm very
nice
good.
To see you. Nice to see you. Sorry, the house is a bit of a mess, so I'm on camera. it's not as salubrious as your bookshelves behind you. Moving on.
Come down and visit us again, John.
I should. No, thank you again for your presentation and some great questions this evening as well.
Indeed.
I think for me, having sat with you in a session and been interrogated, and I have to put it that way for anyone who's never gone through the experience, it's uncomfortable. The whole process is uncomfortable, but liberating at exactly the same time. And the thing I discovered in all of it was that it's that idea of observing, Don. And I would say that my late father, he taught me by action, not by words.
Yes.
And that was a big factor, factor. It's behaviour, it's what you do. And for me, it was the value of patience, being unconditional about how you treat other people. And always being true to the person you are, so integrity. So they were the three things for me that I learned.
That's lovely, John. I mean, I think this whole, the whole discussions that you and I had round about higher purpose had a very powerful impact on me. It's been interesting how we've gone into this space today. But these have been lovely conversations that we've had. But while I've got you there, maybe we can arrange to have a blether offline sometime. I'd love to catch up.
We will definitely do that. We will definitely do that. Take care and thank you for this evening. Thank you.
Take care.
And thank you, Barbara. Thank you.
Oh, bringing people together. Love it.
Indeed.
Anyone else? Last chance. You want to share? Talk about your feedback.
Did anybody choose a young leader as a wise person? No, it's interesting. The person that I choose,
define young.
Sorry?
Define young.
Oh, younger than yourself.
That's everybody.
Right. Of course. No, I'm fortunate to go. I've got two sons. I would describe both of them as being wise, actually, and actually both on a journey on that. And that's not because of the work that I'm doing. I just think it's just observing them grow as young men and the way in which they conduct themselves in the world. So it's a real privilege, I think.
No, I like that one. I've just picked up my daughter Katie, and she's 20. She's 20, and she's much wiser than I am. And anytime I put anything on social media, I ask her first.
Yeah. But Katie, can I ask you a question?
I think I missed that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Katie, would you ever have an ambition to become wise? Is that something you've ever thought about?
Yeah, I think that's, I don't know, it's one of those things that I feel like you strive to be, because then it means you've been about and you've got knowledge and stuff.
Well, that's lovely. Good on you. Sorry to throw that on you there just now. Cheers.
Great, it's great talk. I'm going to go and drive them back to Bathgate. We'll see you later.
You
Okay.
do that. Lovely.
Thanks for the
Okay.
talk.
Cheers.
Bye
All the
now.
best to you. Bye-bye.
Okie dokie. That feels like a lovely place to wrap up for this
It
evening.
does
And
indeed.
just
It
want to
does
say,
indeed.
Don, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for
great
coming
fun.
to talk to us tonight. So big round of applause for you.
Thank you very much. Okay. All the best to you all, folks. Bye-bye.
We'll just do some community
Thank you.
shout-outs if there's any. Sat, Don, do you have any community shout-outs for tonight?
Folk probably know, but tomorrow is the Roman Publisher session. It
Oh,
was
yes.
pretty heavily subscribed. Our friends at Heart of Agile. I'm sure many of you are probably going to tune into that one. Like there's hundreds of people going to that, but just in case you're interested or you weren't aware of it, it's tomorrow night. Yeah. And our next one is our good friend Julian Stodd next week.
The Context of the Social Age with Julian Stodd next week.
Yep.
So that should be good. And yeah, just a massive thanks to all of you tonight for coming along. We will share the recording of the session, and I think we're sharing the slides as well. Is that right, Don? Yep.
Yes, yeah, please.
Cool, awesome. And yeah, so we look forward to seeing you all again, and thanks very much for coming along.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, folks. Good to see you all.